Welcome to the Art in Conversation seminar dedicated to the literature and embodied predictive processing. As usual, we invited two speakers to approach this topic from two different perspectives. As usual, our speakers will give their talks, and after that, we'll have a discussion. And during the discussion, we'll give a chance to everyone ask a question or leave a comment. So please don't forget what you want to ask during the talks. And our first speaker today is Manos Tsakiris, professor at the Department of Psychology, Royal Holloway, University of London, where he leads the lab of Action and Body. He also leads the Body and Image in Arts and Science project at the Warburg Institute, University of London. Professor Tsakiris' research interests are at the intersection of the sciences and humanities, with a particular focus on the biological mechanisms and cultural factors that shape our relationships to other people in a culture powered by images. And to investigate the neurocognitive mechanisms that shape our experience of embodiment and self-identity, Professor Tsakiris uses interdisciplinary approach and a wide range of methods. Professor Tsakiris, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are very happy to host you, and please feel free to share the screen and begin your talk whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina and Nicole. Thank you very much, Karin, for being on the discussion with me today. Let me just share my screen and we can start. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the slideshow, perfect. Just a disclaimer, because what Marina mentioned is partly true. I have been leading the Body and Image in Art and Science project at the Warburg Institute for quite a few years. That project ended a couple of years ago, and have since created the Center for the Politics of Feelings, which is an interdisciplinary center trying to bridge a little bit research in affective neuroscience with political science and political psychology. But my main research area, if you like, is embodiment and the role of embodiment in self-identity and social cognition. And I'm in no means an expert in literature or in humanities more broadly, although I do read quite a lot. And I hope that I will say a few things that will resonate with what Karin will talk about following my brief presentation. And I thought about the title of today's introduction. One could call it being a self, being somebody with a deep body and mind. And I will explain what I mean by a deep body and mind. But we can also rephrase it as the story of the self's body, trying to think about narratives that have to do with one's own self, one's own body, and of course, with narratives about other people's selves and lives. Now, at the background of what I want to say today is probably this idea that Iris Murdoch put very nicely in her novel, The Severed Head. Yes, some people are more their body than others. And I'm very much interested in this question of body awareness and what may be the implications of the different kinds of body awareness, the different qualities of body awareness that we, each one of us, have for understanding oneself, but understanding other people as well, relating to others, whether they are significant others in our life, whether they are unknown others to us, or whether they are the characters and subjects we encounter when we read literature. Now, another related question here is the question of selfhood and how that relates to the question of embodiment. And one aspect by which literature has been very important for the history of ideas of our civilization is beyond, whatever reason each one of us may have about reading literature. Literature also traces the understanding of the self throughout history. But this question of selfhood has also become a subject of scientific inquiry in psychological sciences. But when you think about, the self in psychology, what is this thing that we call the self? And there are many, many, many different types of selfhood that have been investigated in psychological sciences. Strawson here provides an overview of the different concepts, like the cognitive self, the conceptual self, the ecological self, the existential self, the interpersonal self, the material, more bodily self, but also the more narrative self, the philosophical self, and so on and so forth. And I know that a lot of my colleagues work in some of these concepts, in different concepts of selfhood, but I think we do need a starting point. And one of the starting points that I personally found very useful in grounding my research on the sense of self and identity was this idea of minding first and foremost the body. Why? Why should we mind the body? Because all over the world, self begins with the body. This is a quote by one of the most important social psychologists of our time, Roy Baumeister. And the picture that you see here on the screen illustrates this cognitive milestone that we all had in our lifetime. At around the age of 2, when we stood in front of a mirror, we look at the mirror reflection, and for the first time, we realize that this is how we look like. This is how other people come to see the image of our own body. For many developmental psychologists, this moment in time when we actually assume an image for ourselves is one major cognitive milestone. And it's quite interesting that the emergence of this capacity to explicitly recognize oneself in the mirror comes at the same time that infants start displaying more social emotions like shame and pride. And it seems that it is one of the foundational building blocks of selfhood. Another reason why embodiment is so important is because the experience of my own body is at the same time physical and psychological. And what you see here on the screen is an illustration of someone who may be suffering from a body image or an eating disorder. And you can see the tension, the divide between the physicality of the body, that suggests that this is an underweight body, and the psychological experience of that body, which may be suggesting that this is a fat, overweight body. And under normal circumstances, we would expect that you want the physical and the psychological dimensions here to be more congruent than they appear in this image. The third reason why embodiment is so important is because it's not just about oneself, but it is about us. The experience of our own body and the perception of other people's bodies and the bodily interactions we have ground our relations. And this is most evident, of course, when it comes to significant others in our lives. More broadly speaking, you can think that there are different ways in which we can actually become aware of our own body. From the outside, as when we look at ourselves in the mirror, or when I look at my hands or my bodies, when I observe the effects of my own actions in the outside world. But we're also capable of becoming aware of our own bodies from within, when I'm sensing internal states of my physiology. And of course, through the interactions with others, we become aware of our own bodies from and with other people. Now, modern psychology, especially in the last 30 years or so, has focused at the body as a starting point for a science of selfhood. And to a large extent, the focus for most of that period was based on the exteroceptive body. What I mean by exteroception is the perception of the body from the outside, as when I recognize myself in the mirror, on when my brain integrates different sensory modalities that are exteroceptive, such as vision and touch, and tries to combine them into a unitary multisensory percept. And we know from many studies, and I'm not going to go into details about these studies, but we know from many studies that the brain is constantly integrating exteroceptive sensory signals to integrate them and update not only the model that we have of the world, but also the model that the brain has of our own bodies. One good example that may some of you be aware of is the idea that by observing other people's bodily states, movements, facial expressions, and so on, that opens up a window into other people's minds. This is the idea of embodied simulation that is based on work that has been done by some Italian physiologists on the mirror neurons, found first in the macaque monkeys, and then the mirror system observed in human neuroimaging studies. And the idea here is that our brain uses the same kind of networks that we have when we are actually executing actions to understand other people's actions. And through that simulation process, we can actually understand perhaps the intentions of other people or their mental states, why they're doing what they're doing or how they may be feeling. Now, this focus on the exteroceptive body, the body as perceived from the outside, has been quite influential in providing us with key insights about important aspects of our experience, such as the sense of body ownership, the feeling that this body belongs to me, the sense of agency, the feeling that I can control my body and produce the desirable effects in the outside world, and finally, social cognition, that I can understand other people's mental states by stimulating their actions with my own sensory motor system. But it slowly became apparent that we have been neglecting another important dimension, not the exteroceptive body, but the interoceptive body. And what we mean by interoception is the perception of sensations coming from within the body. Think about your heart rate, your breathing, sensations of fatigue or pain or sexual arousal, your gut feelings, more broadly speaking. And at a purely physiological level, interoception serves a critical function, that of homeostasis. In other words, it ensures that the organism will remain within some safe limits that can guarantee the stability of the biological organism. Now, this idea goes back to Claude Bernard's concept of internal milieu, of interoception, a term coined by Sherrington in 1906, and more recently in the work of Cannon, Damasio, and Bart Craig. And even though at the physiological level, interoception can operate quite efficiently without us noticing consciously what goes on, we're also capable of becoming aware of interoceptive states. And here you can see that there are many different dimensions of interoception. You can start from the bottom, where we think about the basic bottom-up signals coming from the viscera to the brain. And just to give you an example, on every single heartbeat that you have, the heart is sending a volley of signals to the brain, informing the brain about the physiological context within which cognition takes place. In other words, about the state of your body. But you can slowly start working upwards and thinking about your capacity to become aware of interoceptive states, such as, for example, becoming aware of your hunger or your fatigue, or becoming aware of particular emotions that are actually caused by changes in this physiological signaling. And then you can think about even higher levels of, people's metacognitive accuracy, how much insight they have into their interoceptive states and the kind of actions that they will perform in order to address some of these interoceptive demands. And as I said, we can be aware of interoceptive states. We can measure that in the lab using different tasks, and I'm not going to go into details, but we can also look at the population and found that there are individual differences in people's ability to become aware of internal states of the body. So we can classify people along a continuum from a lower to a higher capacity to become aware of how their body feels. And this individual difference has important implications, both for self-awareness, but also for awareness of other people. So one of the questions that we have been asking in my lab is, what is this functional importance of the relationship between these two different types that we have to become aware of our own body? From the outside, i.e. exteroception, and from the inside, i.e. interoception. Now, we've done a series of experiments where we found consistently the following pattern. If you think of interoceptive capacities as an individual difference, if you think that some people may be pretty good or good enough at becoming aware of internal states of the body and some people may not be so good, you can look at how this correlates, how it relates with the type of experience that people have about their own bodies when this experience is driven by exteroceptive information. And what we found consistently was that in the absence of accurate interoceptive information, people tend to rely more on how their bodies are perceived from the outside. To give you an example, if you think about body image, in other words, the kind of attitudes that I have towards how I look like versus how I actually become aware of internal states of the body, what we found in both clinical and subclinical populations is that people who don't have a good enough awareness of the body from within, they may be more dissatisfied with their body image, they may be more influenced by how their bodies move, or how their bodies look like, they may objectify their bodies and themselves more. So there seems to be some kind of dynamic balance between these two facets of body awareness, the body as perceived from within and the body as perceived from the outside. And we're still trying to figure out what may be the particular functions that these two dimensions of body awareness may be serving. It may be the case that our brains and our models of the self require both functions, something that allows us to be able to update information from the outside world, incorporate, assimilate this information into our self model. After all, our bodies change over time, and it is important that we adapt in these changes. But at the same time, we may want another function that provides some kind of continuity and stability, even though some aspects of the body are changing. And perhaps interoception is doing this, is actually providing this sense of stability and continuity. And this fits with the kind of modern understanding of the brain, where unlike previous accounts that consider the brain as a passive receiver of information coming from the outside world or from within the body, we currently think of the brain as an inference machine that is constantly generating predictions to explain the kind of sensations we're experiencing. And it is true that the brain is integrating both exteroceptive and interoceptive information constantly, but these channels may be differently weighted depending on somebody's personal history. And this idea of the brain as an inference machine, this constant interplay between what do I predict that there is out there, or what do I predict about my internal sensations versus what are my current sensations, or what is the current sensory input given by the environment, is what may be driving both the brain's learning capacity, but also the organization of the kind of model of ourselves and of other people in the world that we constantly entertain in our brains. Now, is interoception important? It is because we know that it influences a wide range of cognitive domains. People with higher interoception, for example, they have stronger emotional experiences, probably better emotional regulation, probably better affective empathy. We know that interoception influences decision-making, our subjective time perception, but more broadly, our self-awareness and consciousness. And deficits in interoception have been implicated in a wide range of conditions that may have to do with experience of pain, with medically unexplained symptoms, of course, anxiety and affective disorders, but also eating disorders, food and water intake, and addictions, and so on. And in this embodied cognition approach, one would say that it is precisely because we are this kind of beast machines, we have this kind of wet viscera, that we are actually able to perceive the world around us and ourselves within it, and also understand how the world is affecting us. So it is because of the fact that we have this body, and despite of that, that we can engage in the world, with the world in the way we do. Now, before I finish, and I have a few more slides, I'm just going to give you an example, which is, of course, the story of somebody's life, but I think it will open up some ways for the discussion that will follow. was a female graphic artist and videographer around the age of 40, and she was working on a documentary about a kidnapping and a murder. And she had extensively researched and documented the story. She had located and interviewed most of the characters involved. And she was about ready to start filming, but filming never happened because a particular event took place. And these are MM's words. I handed the story back to the producer when it became clear that I could not work the script. I kept repeating the same scenes, and no amount of color-coordinated storylines and post-it notes was going to save me when I was not able to make a simple decision on the spot. So, an event happened, but what is it that happened? She continues. It is my experience that following this event, there is a shift in personality and how emotions are experienced. It is, however, not only emotional blunting, but also an impaired impulse control and disinhibition, as if a grown-up brain has been replaced by a primitive and at times manic brain that affects higher functioning. There is an indifference and striking lack of fear, my emotions are blunted, and there is an unsettling deadness and indifference towards my prior life and aspirations and goals. This indifference and emotional blunting was present as soon as I woke up, and has not left me since. In general, this led to a personality change, in some aspects subtle, in others a profound shift that I find exceedingly difficult to accept, a kind of physiological expression of how I was feeling, zombie-like. This is a phrase that I find very, very, very salient and interesting. I was described in the past by one video critic as a human seismograph, recording the finest shifts in mood and tone. Now I have problems in social settings where I generally might appear antisocial. I force myself to ask questions and engage in banter, but more often I forget. I would say that it has changed, this event, how I relate to people. I do not relate. Now, a particular event happened, and I have presented these passages to many different audiences, and I asked them, what do you think that happened? And the answers vary. Some people say maybe there has been a very traumatic event, and is suffering from a post-traumatic stress disorder. It sounds like a dissociative experience. It could be the onset of a psychotic episode. It could be the result of a brain lesion that resulted in this radical change in the way she relates to herself and to other people. But nothing of that sort happened. What happened is that went for an operation to cure hyperhidrosis, excessive sweating. And in some countries, this is one operation that it's legal. In some countries, it's not commonly used. It's called endoscopic thoracic sympathectomy. And it basically involves the surgical destruction or disabling of the upper spinal sympathetic autonomic nerve trunk. So basically, you're just cutting off one important pathway that sends afferent information from the body to the brain. That cures the hyperhidrosis, but at the same time, when you remove this rich afferent information from the body to the brain, you may end up with a very radical change, basically an inability to actually relate to people in this kind of affective emotive way. And that may be suggesting that interoception, our capacity to actually feel our body and feel it accurately or good enough, may be going at the heart of the self-other relations. One of the key questions of social cognition, but also of literature and probably of all kinds of art forms, is how do we distinguish between self and other at the very time that we're trying to understand each other? And there are some cases where this question of self-other distinction is not important, like in the case of emotional contagion, when there is a complete self-other overlap. I would yawn and you will yawn in response because yawning is contagious. In the effectively salient case of pain, for example, there are more demands on self-other distinction. You want to share aspects of the other person's pain, but you don't want to be fully consumed by it. And of course, there are more difficult cases of self-other relatedness where you have to clearly distinguish between self and other. And not only that, but quite often you have to overcome your egocentric biases and understand, empathize with the perspective of somebody else who is radically different to you. Now, thinking about how the brain is capable of doing this process of social cognition and self-other distinction, there have many different theories that have been put forward. One influential model suggests that the default mode of the brain is to represent one's own states, one's own self. And switching from the self to other, in other words, starting to represent other people's mental states or bodily states or affective states, is an effortful process that may require the attenuation of the self-related representations. Now, this seems to be, if this is valid, then that should be extended in the domain of interoception. And the question is, would people with lower or higher interoceptive awareness be better capable of actually understanding other minds, understanding other bodies, understanding others more broadly? Would it be the case that people with higher interoceptive awareness, because they have a more accurate representation of their own states, would be better able to actually shift the resources and start representing others as distinct from themselves? A capacity that seems to be important for empathy. We have done research in our study suggesting that maybe there is an advantage when the demands for self-other distinction are high, when you try to relate to somebody as a subject who is distinct from you, then people with higher interoceptive awareness, here represented in blue, may have an advantage. They may be better capable to actually distinguish between how they feel themselves and how other people make them feel, and what are the other person's mental and affective states. And this seems to be important both at the domain of early cognitive and affective development, but also in adulthood. And the arguments that we put forward with colleagues of mine are two. One is that in early development, it is with others, basically the primary caregivers, that we start developing a sense of ourselves inside our bodies. And this is quite important because it's not something that humans do by themselves. We do not become aware of our own bodies in isolation, but it's through the interactions with the others, especially when we cannot maintain homeostasis by ourselves. When we're bodies, we have to rely on others. And secondly, that it is through a good enough awareness of our own bodily states that we relate to others as subjects who are distinct from us. And we do have empirical evidence that speak in favor of these two hypotheses. Now, how these relate to the question of the embodied reader? I think a lot of what we're going to discuss today has to do both with the kind of embodiment of the reader, but also how subjectivity, selfhood, and embodiment may be actually portrayed in literature, and how the embodied reader engages with this material. There are a few studies in neuroscience that have looked, for example, at what may be happening when people are reading literature. And this is one of the studies that I find interesting because it points to the idea that maybe different ways of relating to literature in the same way that there are different ways in relating to one's own body. And there may be some interesting parallels between the two that I'm very happy to discuss with Karin afterwards. This is a study where they asked participants to actually read some excerpts from literary novels. And they found that some individuals engaged part of the mentalizing network when they were listening to fiction. Some people tended to engage mainly their sensory motor cortex when they were listening to these stories. So some people may be mostly drawn in a story by mentalizing about the thoughts and beliefs of others. And I think this process of mentalizing is not independent of our capacity to make sense of one's own visceral states, because this is how we learn to make sense of ourselves. We give meaning to our fluctuations, physiological reactions to the world to make sense of how we feel. And we may be using the same kind of process when mentalizing about others. And some other readers may be engaging more by simulating more concrete events, such as actions. In other words, have a more exercetively focused approach to perhaps themselves, other people, but also literally fictional characters. Now, I want to finish with some questions that I think are important. I think they call for more synergies between the humanities and sciences. They may not be easily amenable to experimentation, but they're nevertheless thought-provoking, and they can advance the discussions or the conversations that take place between art and sciences, such as what may be the extroceptive-interoceptive balance in reading. What is it that actually reading does in terms of attuning to one's own interoceptive signals, and how this may be sustaining a self-other distinction when we are reading. That has to do with questions of identification with characters, projection of one's own mental states, affect, desires, and so on, or the introjection of the characters' mental states, affect, desires, and so on. And what may be the importance of levels of interoceptive awareness, in other words, the capacity to accurately read out, perceive one's own interoceptive states. Would engagement with literature make people more intersectively attuned, more intersectively aware? That could be a fascinating, interesting story that will be saying something important about our engagement with art. I'll finish here. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk and bring some of the insights from psychological sciences and affective neuroscience. And I very much look forward to Karin's introduction to the topic and our discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manos, for your great presentation. I would like now to introduce our second speaker today, Karin Kukkonen, Professor of Comparative Literature in the Department of Literature, European Languages and Area Studies of the University of Oslo. She is interested in narratology, poetics, cognitive approaches to literature, and comics. She has published a monograph on comics and cognitive narrative studies titled Contemporary Comics Storytelling, as well as several articles on the topic. She's currently working on literary creativity from this perspective of embodied and probabilistic cognitive approaches to literature, and she authored the book Probability Designs, Literature and Predictive Processing. At the University of Oslo, she leads the research and education initiative called Literature, Cognition and Emotions, which is an interdisciplinary hub that brings together literary studies, linguistics, psychology, and neuroscience in a new conversation about literature. In 2019, she was awarded the first University of Oslo's Young Researchers Prize, and since 2022, she is a member of the Academy of Europe. Professor Kukkonen, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and please feel free to share your slides, and we look very much forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Nicole. Thank you for inviting me, Marina and Nicole, and thank you for sharing the discussion with me, Manos. I'll see if I can share my slides. You should be able to see this now. And in full screen?
Perfect, we can see it. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. I will, I think, make a relatively similar argument to what Manos presented, but from the point of view of literary studies, where this idea that what we read and how we understand what we read is rooted in our bodies, and that it provides a kind of mirror or perhaps a model for how we understand ourselves and how we understand ourselves in relation to others. The research on embodied simulation that Manos has presented is also something that's been taken up in cognitive literary studies, and a lot of research has been done around the ways in which embodied aspects of language, such as motion verbs, indications of direction, descriptions of bodily states, create embodied resonances that give readers a sense of being there in the fictional world, to give readers a sense of experiencing things along with the characters. What I'm interested in discussing today is the question of what is the interoceptive side of this, and how can this predictive processing, predictive coding model contribute to it. One of the things that I suggested in the Probability Designs book is that literature is actually a mental space where you can watch yourself think and react and feel in response to others. I've written about that in Swedish, but I'll present the argument briefly in an article referenced here. The article discusses a book that appeared just 2 years before in Sweden, and that caused a lot of attention. It's by a novelist called Johannes Anjou, and the title can be translated as "They Will Drown in Their Mother's Tears." And by now there is also an English translation of that novel. The novel starts with a terrorist attack on a comic shop in Gothenburg, and it takes up the Charlie Hebdo attacks from Paris, as well as the attack on the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten, and it sets it in contemporary Sweden. But what Anjuru does, which is, I think, extraordinary, is that he takes that situation, starting from the attack in the comic book shop, and then investigates what is sort of the motivation behind that. And it turns out that the person who is the main protagonist, the young woman who is part of that terrorist group, she is convinced that she's been sent back from the future, where nationalist forces in Sweden have made life impossible for the Muslim minority, that she's been sent back from the future in order to change the present. So what we have in this novel is, in principle, a fairly common phenomenon in literature, namely that literary narrative reshapes temporal order, that we usually have flashbacks or flash forwards. There's usually some kind of temporal looping in order to create suspense. Indeed, already in the 1920s, literary theorist Victor Shklovsky said that Tristram Shandy, a novel which of course famously creates all kinds of temporal turbulences and distortions, is the most conventional novel in history because it foregrounds exactly that reshaping of temporal order. There's a second thing that literature does, which is closer to the embodiment question, and that is shifting the perspective from which readers perceive things. Just the choice of that female protagonist as the first focalizing point of the novel, of course, creates reaction. It starts, the first sentence is, "This is her first memory." And here we have something else that's quite typical of literature, that we get insight into a person's mind, but told from a third person point of view. So already in that combination of third person narration, but from a first person perspective, we have a sort of distortion or design of how experience is presented that is unusual. Indeed, Anjuru, as he tells that first scene, that scene of the attack, creates this distortion exactly by linking it to the embodied experience of the protagonist, saying at some point that she experiences herself as if seen from the outside in a dream. So she gets this very weird exteroceptive perception of herself. So it's not just the very controversial topic that helps you watch your responses as you read this novel, but it is, I would argue, something that is very much ingrained in the way in which literary texts shape both their narrative and their language. And here the predictive processing comes in, because embodied readers are not just getting a sense of presence in the fictional world, but they also get a quite unusual way of presenting it. So they get, across various levels, prediction errors, unexpected things happen which force you to change your expectations, what do you think is probable in a particular context. So the logic, there's a systematization of these prediction errors in a literary narrative, that logic that develops across time. And this is what I call a probability design, the way in which the literary language redesigns the sensory flow that we take up while we read. So that is one side of the story. Now the question is, how do we get interoception into it? And here I refer to an article where I discussed another quite contemporary novel by Otessa Moshfegh, My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Moshfegh's novel starts with a quite unpromising premise, namely the main protagonist decides to go to sleep for a year. She finds a psychologist who will make the necessary prescriptions for sleeping pills. So she starts taking sleeping pills, wakes up every couple of days, washes, eats something, takes more sleeping pills, goes to bed again. But of course, in that process, she learns quite a lot about her own bodily experience. And Moshfegh, as an author, I think is extraordinary in bringing that into language. I'll give you a quotation from early on in the novel as the protagonist is trying to go to sleep. "I was going to sleep now, I hoped. I tried to surrender, but I would not sleep. My body refused. My heart shuddered, my breath caught. Maybe now is the moment, I thought. I could drop dead right now, or now. But my heart kept up its dull bang bang, thudding against my chest like reaper banging on my door." What you have here are all kinds of elements of interoception. You could go up and down the list, I think, that Manos has provided of the different aspects and elements of interoception, of the perception of inner states. But what I think is even more interesting here is that it's not just mentioned, it's not just indicated by talking about the heart and the breath, for example, but also by the way in which the language enacts that. Maybe now is the moment, I thought. I could drop dead right now, or now. The now gets repeated, but it gets repeated at not rhythmical intervals, which in a way enacts the fact that the heart seems to shudder and the breath seems to catch. It doesn't seem to be able to engage in a regular rhythm. And while we're reading, the text is not just showing us that, but it also sort of does what it says. So it's both, I think, the semantic content, what's there in the language that creates an interoceptive resonance, but also the way in which the syntax and the rhythm of the language across time relates to, say, our heartbeat, the rhythm at which we breathe. Now, literary language, like any other kind of perception, is of course an integration of different aspects. So some aspects can be exteroception dominant, like in this example from the very beginning of the novel, where we just get descriptions of what she perceives and what she is doing. There is very little in that description which would evoke interoception, and if a text maintains that over long periods, we tend to describe it as sort of disaffected, as distancing. For example, Camus' The Stranger is quite exteroception dominant. Moshfegh, exactly because of this topic of exploring the inner experience, is usually interoception dominant in terms of language. But she also has passages where the two are integrated. And I guess most modern fiction would actually create that kind of integration of exteroception and interoception, where we have some sense of the emotional response. In that case, I truly hated her in that moment. Exteroception, watching her navigating the icy roads, craning her neck to see over the dashboard from the sunken seat of the car. So this is not stable. All of these examples are taken from Moshfegh's novel. So as we read through a novel, these two different modes of perception are engaged and can create, of course, different kinds of effects. And I would suggest that this kind of drawing attention to interoception, both in semantic content, but also in the way in which it's enacted in the syntactic rhythm, may create interoceptive accuracy, the sensibility, this sort of confidence in interoception and interoceptive awareness that Manos was talking about, that we have a sort of relatively accurate understanding of how well we're doing in being in touch with our inner selves. So one question, of course, would be whether while we're reading such a text, our interoceptive awareness is increased or not. And I guess that is open to an empirical investigation. But I think there is a second argument which supports the hypothesis that literary texts are particularly good at drawing attention to interoceptive states. And I think that is something which is to do with the overall setup of the reading situation. Manos talked about homeostasis between exteroception and interoception. And within the predictive processing discussions, that has been mostly taken up with respect to the fact that we need to have a relatively stable interoception. So we don't want our heart to be pounding, we don't want our tummies to be upset, in order to be able to be explorative and adventurous when it comes to our engagement with the outside world. We are not reducing prediction error in the sense that we sit in a dark room and lock the door. I mean, that would ultimately minimize prediction errors. We don't need to do that because we have exactly that balance where part of our bodily perception is relatively stable or kept stable, so that we can be more adventurous in the other dimension. I would suggest that actually the exact opposite is the case when we sit down to read a book. When we sit down to read a book, we don't like to have a lot of noise around us. We tend to sit quite still. Also, the visual stimulus that we have, the letters on the page, just black and white, it's a relatively poor stimulus and doesn't give us a lot to disrupt exteroceptive focus. So in reading a literary text, we have a very stable exteroceptive situation, which I would argue, if that balance argument holds, enables us to explore and to be adventurous in tapping into our perception of our own bodies and, of course, our sense of self. Now, if that is right, we want to think about, I think, a second line of argument that is relevant with respect to self reading and memory, and that is the discussion around mind wandering. In the study of mind wandering, quite often literary texts are actually used as stimuli, and they're used as stimuli to then ask readers afterwards how much they remember of what they've read. And if you don't remember a good deal, then you've probably been mind wandering, and there are different methods to test this. Now, one of the concerns that Regina Fabri and I have voiced with respect to that is that actually for most readers, we don't read in order to have a summary at the end, but we often do read with aspects of mind wandering, with aspects of moving away from the exact words in front of us, contributing to a quite rich and often personally relevant reading experience. Now, there is a distinction in mind wandering between zoning out and tuning out. So zoning out is the kind of mind wandering where you've read to the end of the chapter, but you have no idea how you got there and what was there on the page. That is zoning out. You forget that you're not on task. Another kind of mind wandering is tuning out. That is, you are aware that you're mind wandering while you're doing it. And I think that is the kind of mind wandering which contributes to reading as a personally rich experience, and which can, I think, also be linked to the embodied dimension of reading. The argument that reading, mind wandering, creates personal relevance can be developed in dialogue with other work that has been done in empirical literary studies around creating personal relevance. So you remember things in relation to what you're reading while you're reading it. You have personal remindings, as Larsen and Salman call them. And these memory elements are linked to mind wandering because apparently memory as a kind of mental time travel links to this default mode network, which also seems to underlie mind wandering. And apparently mental time travel, it's of course a metaphor, but some recent research has suggested that actually giving people a movement illusion of moving forwards and backwards triggers, if you give a movement illusion moving forwards, you're more likely to think about the future. And giving a movement illusion moving backwards, you're more likely to think about the past. So here, I think, is a way in which you can tie together the mind-wandering mental time dimension with an embodied side of reading. And, of course, the self that emerges in remembering and imagining. So what would this look like in respect to reading a passage from a novel? And this is my final example from Moshe Fei's Year of Rest and Relaxation. This is a sentence when she takes the last of the sleeping pills. I began to drift down into the darkness, descending at first so slowly and steadily. I felt I was being lowered by pulleys, by angels with gold-spun ropes around my body, I imagined. And then by the electric casket lowering device they used at both my parents' burials. And so my heart quickened at that thought, remembering that I had parents once, and that I had taken the last of the pills, and that this was the end of something, and then the rope seemed to detach, and I was falling faster. So here we have two evocations of mental time travel. We have imagined, we have remembering. The imagined goes together with a fairly rich description, probably creating visual mental imagery, the angels with the gold-spun ropes. But we also have quite a lot of embodied language embedding the mental time travel. And I would call these embodied anchors, because on the one hand, the literary text allows you to get out of the immediate engagement with the words in front of you, but you don't necessarily want to completely go off course. There needs to be a mechanism that pulls you back into the text, that pulls you back into the reading experience. And I think embodiment plays an important role here. In this very beautifully written single sentence, we have the single downward trajectory that is maintained across the entire sentence, from I began to drift down to then the rope seemed to detach and I was falling faster. So I think this is a very clear way how this text keeps readers on track, even though it leaves exactly that explorative space for mind wandering and self-awareness. And I think here interoception is particularly relevant, because the single interoceptive reference, and so my heart quickened, in the middle of the sentence provides actually a turning point. Here we have a sudden acceleration in the speed, and so my heart quickened, and then I had taken the last of the pills, and that this was the end of something, and then the rope seemed to detach and I was falling faster. So this speeding up that is also referenced in what the text says is enacted in the syntax after the heart quickened, that is, began to beat faster. So I think the interoception often provides a turning point or a certain highlight in creating such embodied anchors. So these, of course, are theoretical explorations, theoretical discussions based on close reading of literary texts, along with the kind of research that has been done in interoception and predictive processing. It suggests, I think, that the embodied reader is not just simulating the embodied language of a text, but actually creates a space for inner reflection and exploration, and that the relationship between interoception and exteroception in the moment of reading is strikingly and significantly, especially for questions of interoception, different from the homeostasis where we keep interoception stable in a real-world environment. The question then, of course, empirical, and that would be my question to Manos, is whether this reading enables better interoceptive awareness. Is this something that's just going on while we read? Or if you read a lot, are you generally better at it? Is there a trait in readers? And the question is also, I think, how this unfolds over time in dialogue with the design of the literary text, because most novels we do not read in a single setting. We leave them, we come back to them. So there is a sort of developing, I think, interoceptive attunement or interoceptive pacing going on. The final point which I would raise as a kind of provocation, is the question of whether literary reading may actually provide us with something similar to meditation, exactly because it keeps exteroception relatively stable, but with the difference that because we're engaging with other characters and because we're creating this space for reflection, watching ourselves think, this might actually be more effective in creating this self-to-other awareness through reading rather than meditation practices. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Karin, for your very interesting presentation. So yes, we usually begin the discussion by giving a chance to our speakers to comment on each other's talks or answer the questions. So Manos, do you want to maybe answer Karin's questions and comment on her presentation? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Karin, for your presentation. I was very, very struck by the idea, which I would like to discuss more and explore more, that reading actually provides this kind of stable exteroceptive context where you get the opportunity for more interoceptive exploration, which I think it resonates with my experience, and I think probably there is quite a lot that can be said about that. I find it a very intriguing proposal. With regards to your question as to whether reading makes us better at interoception, I will say that most of the kind of art or more broadly aesthetic experiences that we may have, they open up new ways of experiencing ourselves in the world. And in that sense, I would say probably yes, but I don't have any empirical evidence. I don't even know whether such empirical evidence are needed to support that idea. What we do know from some studies is that perhaps people with better interoception, they may have a more in-depth aesthetic experience. We know that from other art forms. My colleague Julia Christensen, who's both a psychologist, neuroscientist, and a professional dancer, she has done studies looking at how people perceive dance, especially expressive and technically correct, technically expert dance movements versus technically expert dance movements that are not so expressive. And she did found difference between people with higher and lower interoception insofar their ability of correctly recognizing the dance movements that were actually expressive. So it seems that, you know, better interoception may be bringing about an advantage in engaging with this art form, in that case, dance. I would imagine that would probably generalize to other art forms. We do know that probably people with better interoception, they're better capable of performing well at affective empathy tasks. And I think one of the questions that reading literature poses on us is this question of empathy. How do we understand others when we read about them, how we empathize with them? So I would say that what we're discussing probably makes sense given what we know from your discipline and my discipline, but a lot of these questions remain unanswered from the empirical side of things. But I don't even know whether we need empirical data and for what reason to answer these questions.
Why do you think we wouldn't need empirical data for it?
Why do I think that we wouldn't need? I mean, there is this tendency that you need to quantify things, and probably, you know, funding bodies and governments, they want to have, you know, strong evidence so that they can inform, you know, their educational policy or their funding policy and so on. I'm a bit skeptical as to whether we should quantify the value of arts in that kind of way. I think it is important to understand a little bit the mechanisms. Yes, it is important to understand a little bit the effects. But we do have a very long history in our civilization that speaks to the value of arts in our society. So I don't think that we need the data to support the value of arts and what actually arts does to the humans that share it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it would also be very hard to actually, I mean, devise a simple test, exactly because, I mean, literary texts are quite different. You experience them differently when you read them for a second time or a third time. So even if you have the same reader, there isn't, that doesn't remain stable over time, because we also, as our biography develops, so do our reading experiences. So I think there is that dimension, which I think is very important, and yeah.
I think that's right, and that, I want to link that to something that you said towards the end of your presentation, which I also found very interesting, which was this question that, we very rarely sit down and start and finish a book in one go. But, we will come back and, quite often you will read for weeks, sometimes months, the same book until you finish it. But there is, from my experience, I'm talking about my experience, there is some kind of unique affective tone, climate that each book comes with. And even though, I go back to the book at intervals and I read it over time, when I pick it up to continue reading, I can actually get back into this kind of climate. And this is what actually enables me to get back, to get back into the story, the narrative, and the characters. This unique affective tone that each book has, which is the creation of the author, of how it sets up the narrative and the characters, and how this affect me. So I know how each book and how each character will start affecting me, and I go back to that kind of feeling whenever I pick up the book to continue reading.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you use climate as the metaphor. That it's, something we experience, through temperature, or how moist the air is, that kind of thing. So it's I guess you could describe a reading situation as a kind of microclimate that you enter when you open the book.
Yes. I was making more the difference between, the weather and the climate, and I think of it as something which is a bit more diachronic. It lasts for longer, and it's like a season. I can think of books like seasons in some sense, which of course it does come also with interesting bodily experiences, what each kind of season of climate actually does to your embodiment.
Yeah, and why
so
we
it's
feel...
just a metaphor.
Yeah, no, but I think it's an interesting metaphor, because on the one hand, I think it picks up this sort of subtle state, like, if it's 5 degrees warmer than before, you know that immediately without having to look at the thermometer or anything like that. But also the sense that there is a characteristic quality to it. Even if I'm thinking of Ali Smith's seasonal quartet, where she's got 4 books, starting with autumn, winter, spring and summer. And they're all written in her very distinctive style, but they all have a slightly different feel to them. So I guess even across books, you can create a climate in reading. I think that is an important aspect for it, but I think at the same time there is also a way in which the narrative that is being constructed is set up in such a way that you can go in and out, and you don't have to recall everything that you've read before in order to make sense of what's happening next. So I think that is also a very important art of writing novels, that you can leave them, but you can come back to it without too much of you don't need a "this happened last time" summary to be able to continue. And I think that sort of developing logic of the narrative would complement the climate or the feel of the fictional world.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind that if someone has a question, you can raise your virtual hand or write a question in the chat. And I can see that Noah has a question. Do you want to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask that now it seems very well established that embodiment is a very important factor that affects our engagement with literature. I just wanted to ask, what do you think about visualization? Like, is it also important? Is it one of the factors? Are people with higher imagery capacities better able to engage with characters versus people with low visualization capacities?
I think that is a very interesting question. I mean, I'm not aware of any kind of comparative research that has been done into different kinds of mental imagery. There's obviously visual mental imagery, which has been discussed quite a lot in cognitive literary studies, the sort of images in the head that are evoked by a literary text. But I think at the same time, the embodied mental imagery, which is to do with, a movement illusion or these interoceptive state, the rhythmic quality of it, that is, of course, also imagery, mental imagery, or that you hear a voice, auditory mental imagery. I would suspect that there are some readers who are very good visualizers, and there are some readers who are very good at imagining voices. And then there are some readers who are much more likely to, really go into this embodied experience. So that would be my relatively uninformed response to it.
Thank you. No, is that it? That was your question, right? Okay, thank you. Linda has a question. Linda, do you want to ask your question, please? Linda, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Yeah. First of all, just excuse me. I can't turn on my camera because I don't know. I've got some power issues, and I'm afraid I'll just lose the whole thing if I try to do that. I'm just saying I'm like enjoying this very, very much, and I thought it particularly, perhaps in terms of my own research, provocative to say that maybe empirical studies are not necessary when it comes to reader experience or reader response. I mean, I think I totally understand the kind of reason, not need, and not quantifying the arts, but I think empirical qualitative studies are valuable not to prove the value of an artistic form, but to demonstrate how readers react to the stimuli within the environment of readings. For example, my research involves readers in digital comics. I was particularly interested, Karin, to hear about your background with comics. Now everybody I've interviewed have said, and people I haven't interviewed have said, well, everybody prefers print comics, and they prefer even the haptic experiences of print comics. And those are the loud voices in the kind of comic sector. But the exploratory research I've done revealed a whole world of not just reacting to content, but bodily responses to the device and the software. In fact, one of our papers is titled from one of our readers' response to scrolling and the spaces between panels in webtoons. And if people don't know webtoons, those are basically webcomics made for smartphones. One of our readers, when they were talking about scrolling and whatever, talked about their heart going boom, boom, because the experience of the anticipation of what was going to happen next. And that it didn't just come from the content. Of course, the content contributed to it, but the act of scrolling and having to kind of wait, until you could scroll down to that next panel was all part of that anticipation. And I'll just add one more thing. I know I'm kind of rambling here, but Another thing that they said, which was very interesting, is that sometimes when you're scrolling, and I think we've all had this experience, you get your system and whatever gets hung up, and it won't scroll anymore because it seems like there's too much information, and you have to kind of wait for everything to kind of right itself. They said that even this kind of technical issue with the software created that kind of anticipatory, on the edge of their seat, their heart kind of pounding experience. And I mean, I was just blown away by that, and especially because, with my work, so many people kind of denigrated digital comics and the use of devices with comics, and print comics are so wonderful and all that kind of stuff. And to hear this kind of a reaction that, readers feel more in control, they feel there's more a sense of anticipation and whatever, was just great. So anyways, I do think that there is a role for empirical studies, if only to kind of to prove that those experiences are still open in the digital environment. Thank you,
Linda. Thank you, Linda. Manos, do you want to reply, or Karin, please?
Just a comment that I totally agree. I mean, I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't be doing empirical research in these questions. Of course we should. What I was trying to say is that we shouldn't use this as a justification for, questioning or supporting the value of art, or, the art and aesthetic experiences more broadly in society, especially in relation to, funding decisions, education, and so on. Because there is a shift, especially in UK, more towards STEM subjects, less and less teaching of art subjects at schools and so on. And I just, don't want to be part of that narrative. I think, we should be absolutely free to do the research that we want on all these questions, but not as a means of justifying or not the importance of art and culture.
Thank you. Great, Karin, if you don't want to add anything to that.
Yes? Say something about the web comics. I think it's quite interesting, exactly what you mentioned, that there is this sense that comics on screen aren't as good as they're on paper. And I think in those cases, people mostly think of, the comics that were first printed on paper and were then scanned, and then you can look at them on the screen. But of course, they were made to be part of a comic book or a graphic novel or whatever paper format you have. So they work according to the material logic of a book. Whereas the web comics that you're talking about, they're made for the web. So they actually exactly depend on the scrolling rather than turning pages. So I think that is also a dimension which is quite important to keep in mind when we're talking about these things, that the very material setup of the medium will actually determine quite a lot of how it needs to be designed to create these embodied effects in readers.
Great, thank you very much for this. And we also have a question from Eric. Eric, please.
Thank you for the fascinating presentations. I'd like to go back, if it's okay, to something you just mentioned, but didn't go into very much, both of you, and that's the second reading. What happens with the second reading and how that influences embodied feelings and things like that. And you mentioned that in some ways it's probably different, the second reading. But what I find so fascinating is in many ways it's the same or it's similar. So that I think of it maybe in these terms, that when I'm reading something for the first time, I'm creating models and I'm trying to fill in the models as I go along, just like I would in normal everyday experience. But when I'm reading a second, third, or even fourth time, there really isn't any uncertainty there. That in some respects, the models are already in my mind, what happens the beginning, middle, and end. And yet somehow I feel surprise, at certain points, but I can't possibly be surprised. Or am I looking at this the wrong way? Or I might feel suspense, but I know exactly what's going to happen. So I'm just wondering what you both would say about that kind of experience on the second or even fourth reading of a novel.
Thanks, Eric. Karin, Manos, do you want to reply to that?
I'd be happy. Do you want me to go first?
If you wish, yeah.
Yeah. I think there is always a sort of double temporal thing going on. On the one hand, you're reading the words as you're going along. So you're still in that moment where you don't know, I don't know, what happens to the Count of Monte Cristo or something like that. And I think exactly because you're reading with your body, that keeps you in that now moment while you're reading. But at the same time, exactly on the basis of that ongoing embodiedly rooted development, that also, if you then experience the second reading in a different way, gives you the comparability, so that you even notice that, okay, this time I'm focusing, for example, on a different character, or this time, or to give one example, I mean, as someone who teaches literature, I have to read the same novels at least once or twice a year, every semester. And one of the texts that I have taught quite a few times now is Crime and Punishment. And it took me about 4 or 5 semesters until I started reading it as a comedy, because there are actually quite a lot of funny coincidences, funny moments in the novel. I think it takes a long time to get out of that focalization of Raskolnikov, which is, of course, not comedic at all. But I think there is also that second element that allows the comparability on top of it.
If I may.
Yes, sure.
Just, Eric, what you're saying is very interesting, but my question is it on the second or third reading the same elements that surprise you, or is it different things that you discover while you're reading the same novel again? In the same way, you know, I've read probably few novels more than once, but I've watched many of my favorite movies 2 or 3 or 4 times, and it was almost always something different that it wasn't detected, or it didn't register, or, you know, I was in a different kind of mood or state. I was preoccupied with different questions at the time, and I picked up different things. So that was a question. Is it the same thing that surprised you in the second or the third reading as what surprised in the first one?
Well, I think it could go either way. And like I said, it can't really be surprise on the second reading, especially if you're focusing on the same thing. But maybe suspense would be a better example. You can still feel suspense at the same points in the movie, even though you know how it ends. And there, I would say, yeah, at least in my experience,
And I would say that in the same way that, you know, you can have exactly the same play staged by different directors, and you know really well, you know, the story. It's always Hamlet. It's the same thing, but the staging is different, and that creates a different kind of climate, affective tone, and so on. And I think when you're reading, it's not just a passive experience, right? So this constant, you know, dialogue between you as a reader, and in a sense, when you're reading it again, you're staging in your mind the novel one more time, and that may be slightly different within the constraints of what is the story, which is more or less the same.
Yeah, but you pick up on different things. Exactly because the story is the same, you can follow the narrative as it goes, but then suddenly start paying attention to, I don't know, a minor character that you've not noticed before, that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I can
Yes.
add to that, perhaps there's an element of like reading again, or watching a movie again, or listening again to the same piece of music that we like. There is a pleasure that we experience, and the fact that we can predict what is going to happen kind of reduces the prediction error, and then therefore it kind of confirms our internal model. So I guess my question would be, in terms of like the embodied experience, what would be the implication of of going through that experience again and knowing what is going to happen? Would it have a more enhanced embodied experience or not? What? I guess this is a question for
it would be pleasurable, as you say, because the prediction error is minimized.
I mean, in terms of the intensity of the experience, I'm assuming, I mean, the prediction would be.
But it's not just the intensity that matters, right? It may be a more intense experience the first time, but maybe more pleasurable the second time.
Or you can, decide what you want to pay attention to, which is also, you can create your own new prediction errors, if you will, which is also pleasurable as a sort of autonomous element of reading.
Thank you very much for this. I can see that there's a second question from Noah. Do you want to ask your question? You're muted, sorry, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If we have time for this, I just wanted to ask, there was about the difference between audiobooks and usual books, and because there was this paper by Amazon Audible, they did both audiobooks and the movie scenes, and they asked participants to report their engagement, and they also measured the temperature and heart rate and so on during watching those scenes versus audio versus movies, and they found that people reported that they engaged more with the visual scenes, but the physiological measures was different. It was like people as if they reacted more to the audio ones. So it's very difficult to explain these results. So I was thinking, do you have any insight about how to explain what happened, why people would feel that they engage more with the visual, but their physiological measures would say the opposite?
I think it's an interesting question, but you should remember that the physiological reactions are not always aligned with subjective reports.
Yes.
And I don't know the exact aspects of that particular study. So they compared audio only storytelling versus
the movie
films.
Game of Thrones, a specific scene, one as in the form of the audiobooks, and the other one is the TV show.
Yes, my intuition here, and I haven't read the research, is that having just the auditory channel leaves you with much more uncertainty about what is actually going on, and that may put people in a heightened state of arousal or expectation, and that may explain the heightened physiological reaction. But of course, when you have more senses, like both vision and audition in the kind of film, you would find that much more engaging and probably easier to follow the flow of the story and better able to make predictions about what is happening afterwards.
I see. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We don't really have much time. I'm just going to very quickly add a small comment or question. So there is a growing body of research that when people engage with literary fiction, that increases their social cognition abilities, understanding emotions of other people. And this was replicated in several different studies, but the question is, what is the mechanism which underlies that? Why? And I heard in the literature several explanations of what is the potential mechanism which underlies this effect. And some suggest that literary fiction, creates something kind of a simulated world where people can train their social cognition as we train our muscles in the gym. And there's also another explanation that people just get knowledge about social interactions in the literature because writers, they use a lot of psychological words to explain what other people feel and think, etc. But I think maybe interoception is another potential mechanism which underlies this effect. And maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I never saw this explanation in the literature. Like no one tried to explain this effect of fiction on social cognition via interoception. So I just wonder if you think that it's worth it to write about this, because I am not sure I saw that involving interoception to explain that effect. And I think explaining that effect is important because, well, this helps us understand how we can enhance social cognition. We know that people with autism, for example, have difficulties with that. So that's a pretty important issue. Thank you.
I can say something. I can say something because I think that's a fascinating question, and I think what Karin was saying goes at the heart of the matter here. If the reading experience provides this kind of stable exteroceptive context that enables interoceptive exploration, you have a way to actually explain the findings that you described, Marina. But I think we should also, do this research together with experts like Karin, because for me it would be very interesting to compare different types of literature that may be probing more different aspects of what you're describing, character building or, mind wandering and interoceptive sensations, and see, whether exposure to different types, different genres of literature could have different effects. In other words, engaging differently these mechanisms of, social cognition or interoception. Although in real life they're not completely independent, but I think it's this idea of the stable exteroception enabling interoception, or the other way around. I think it's a very interesting way to set up the hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do something on that. I think one of the things that you mentioned, this study of simulating fiction, where people were listening, and they were already using different genres, weren't they? Yes. More action-based, more character-based, more story world-based. I haven't read the study. I'm just referring to what you said about the article. But what surprised me is that they chose to have people listen to the story and not read them. And I think that, especially with respect to interoception, would make a huge difference. Because if you're listening to the story, you're not self-paced. You're paced by the speed at which the words come to you. And I think a very important aspect of, taking the space that you need to have these inner explorations is actually that in reading you're self-paced. You can decide how quickly you go, how much you want to follow the syntax, whether you want to, sub-vocalize what you're reading yourself, that kind of thing. I think would be very interesting to explore what it is that readers actually do, and if there are some regularities that relate to, I don't know, fast-paced action or rich characters, that kind of thing.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you very much, both our speakers and the people that contributed to the discussion. I really enjoyed it, and it's really great to see how the overlap between humanities and science works so well together. So thank you very much for your contribution. I just would like to end the meeting reminding that our next seminar is going to be about music as proprioceptive art, the 26th of April. And I would like to thank again our speakers. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you for having us.